and I'm looking forward to your thoughts. I find Lee to be one of the truly original thinkers about democracy and the future of the Democrats. And Lee, welcome.
Well, excited to have this conversation. Thanks for inviting me on.
Yeah. I love the about page on your Substack where you talk about um, if you require immediate assistance, please press 0. Be warned, we're experiencing long wait times, and our options have changed. And our democracy is on the line, and clearly our options have changed. So, curious, what your take is on how our options have changed.
Well, I've been toiling in this field of democracy reform for several years now. In 2020, I published this book called "Breaking the Two-Party Doom Loop: The Case for Multi-Party Democracy," in which I argued that we should get out of the two-party system and move to a system of proportional representation. And at the time, in 20 early 2020, this was 2 months before COVID. People said, "Oh, that's an interesting idea. Maybe you're right, but this will never happen. Two-party system is stuck. No change will never happen." So then COVID happened. The book kind of receded a little bit after the initial push. But then January 6th happened, and suddenly there was a lot of interest in reform, and I feel like I was talking to a lot of journalists and philanthropists for a few weeks there, and then kind of hit a slow boil. Then a little bit ago, I noticed that Texas was doing this mid-decade gerrymandering thing, which was pretty outrageous, and suddenly people started asking some more questions about why do we do elections this way? At the same time, I've been seeing growing interest in electoral reform. So I think as our democracy begins to fall apart, people are more and more asking questions of like, well, why do we do elections this way? Why do we do things this way? And realizing, well, we can do things some other way. So I do feel like our options have expanded, and more people are open to asking some really fundamental questions
You
now.
know, interesting. One of the striking things about the Trump presidency thus far has been the complete absence of checks and balances. And, Congress has fallen in line, and the Supreme Court has not proven to be a real check on Trump. And you have some interesting thoughts about that. I was reading, from your book on why the two-party system has sort of negated checks and balances.
Yeah. Well, I mean, look, go back to 1787 when we uh, when our Constitution dates from, and a bunch of uh, folks getting together for a summer in Philadelphia trying to figure out how to design a system of government. And, you know, they were operating with pretty limited knowledge and a lot of theory. And they thought, particularly Madison, who was kind of generally considered the father of the Constitution, thought, well, the way you maintain democratic harmony is by having a lot of different centers of power. And so we'll have, you know, a legislature. Now, at the time, people thought legislatures were going to be the dominant institution, but you'll have bicameralism to prevent from being too powerful. Then you'll have a separate president who was supposed to be a check on the legislature, not the other way around. And you'll have courts, which were envisioned to be not quite what they've become, uh, but and then of course federalism. So the one thing that they didn't think about was political parties. Well, actually, they thought about political parties a little bit. They said we don't want political parties and so let's not have them. But upon actually organizing a Congress and running elections, the same people who said political parties are bad realized that you need political parties, and quickly the country became quite divided. And the election of 1800 was actually one of the nastiest in U.S. history. But the basic idea of separation of powers that included federalism. I think federalism played a much more important role in maintaining the overall stability, although it created some other problems. Uh, Lasted for quite a long time, and it's really not until well, I mean, of course, there's the 1850s, so it lasts up until the 1850s, and then the whole thing breaks down, Civil War, and then it comes back together, and then it really lasts again until 1990s, 2000s, when you start to get that same level of binary polarization in which the parties go from these overlapping coalitions that differ across states to this one extremely nationalized, extremely bifurcated conflict that then subsumes everything. So the idea that the president and Congress would have different interests, or the courts and president would have different interests, which was, of course, the original theory of separation of powers, just falls apart because it's just Democrats versus Republicans. That becomes this like giant black hole of a conflict that subsumes everything else. And sometimes I think of it as a collapse of dimensionality, that you have all these different forces pulling in all these different directions when you have a multidimensional, multifaceted political system. But what has happened really over the last 2 decades is just everything has collapsed and flattened into this single binary dimension, and that has destroyed any pretense of the idea that there should be separate centers of power and in different institutions. Everything has lined up.
And party loyalty basically becomes paramount.
Yeah, and it's it's really, but it's party loyalty driven by animosity, right? That it's not even that people are so loyal to their own party, but they don't want the other side to have a chance at winning. Because if the other side is in power, it's the end of things. Everything breaks down. And in that world, you can justify all kinds of horribles, because, well, now Trump may be lying about the election, or maybe not, but if Democrats win, that would be the end of everything. So maybe he wasn't lying after all.
Yeah. And so the Democrats have gotten themselves into a particularly bad spot. You make the point that they kind of been maneuvered almost against their will into being the defenders of the norms, almost the more conservative party than
Yeah.
the radical party of the Republicans.
Yeah, I mean, it's a weird shift. I think, we often talk about liberal versus conservative, left versus right. But really, I think that Democrats have become the conservative party, that they're the party of the existing institutions, and the Republicans have become really the radical revanchist party, that they just want to tear everything down and just like, build a cultish fascist state. You know, is increasingly how things look, with some like vague notion of like Christian nationalism as like the savior of everybody, uh, which is just a very weird perversion of, of the Republican tradition in America. So everything has kind of gone topsy turvy. But I mean, the challenge is that we are in a moment, and we have been for a while, of really increasingly strong anti-institutional, anti-system feelings, and I think that comes from a real sense among most people that something is not working, and that there is an economy in which a handful of people are getting super rich, and most people feel like they're barely making it. They just run pedal harder on the stationary bike, and somehow they don't go anywhere. Uh, and that creates a sense of brokenness, and then politicians have channeled that into this divisiveness, which then creates a further sense of brokenness. And so for decades now, the share of Americans who say the country is on the wrong track is like 2 to 1 at least, now even more, as compared to those who say it's on the right track. And so it's the Democrats have, as the party of government, they are the party of institutions, really, uh, and they keep saying, "Oh, the institutions work. Let's not change anything." And when Trump came to power in 2016, he ran against the Republican Party. He ran against the institutions, and a lot of people thought, "Oh, well, he'll never succeed." But I think what we all underestimated, and what we continue to underestimate, is just how much anger and distrust and alienation there is in the polity writ large. And Democrats have just not figured out how to respond to that in a way that resonates.
And you've tried to address that issue very, I think, very interestingly in your Vox article and your Substack. Um, what do you think they should do about this situation?
Well, I think the way I think about this is that fundamentally politics is always going to be about conflict, right? Politics is about the things that we disagree over, and conflict is interesting. Conflict is always going to dominate. The what the press covers, what the media covers, are the fights, the things that are going wrong. And the challenge in this for Democrats is that the dominant conflict in American politics for the last decade has been essentially anti-system versus system. And being on the side of the system, as the Democrats have been, it is not a winning position on the dominant conflict. Now, I look back to 2024 election, and Democrats made a choice to say we are the defenders of democracy, which, like, great. I think democracy is pretty important, but I know that most people in this country don't feel democracy is working particularly well. And just to say, well, support democracy without saying, well, we actually want to make democracy work better by doing things like tackling big money in politics, tackling issues of corruption, like serious anti-corruption reform, and tackling issues of limited electoral competition. Right? The sense that people don't really feel like they have much of a choice in how they vote because we have a two-party system in theory, but in most places there's just one dominant party. So Democrats could have said we want to make democracy work, and so they said, well, the other side wants to tear down democracy. Bad conflict. Okay, I've diagnosed the problem without suggesting. Well, I've hinted at the solution here, which is that Democrats need to offer a different vision of politics, a different conflict. So there are certainly many ways in which uh, you can organize the conflict in politics, but I think the you can't just accept what the existing conflict is and then keep saying, oh, but you know, but Republicans are bad and we're not Trump. You have to say, actually, this is what we're fighting for. Now, take an issue like crime. Democrats are on the defensive about crime. We had this whole fight about whether the government should, whether the federal government should send the National Guard into Washington D.C., where I live. And Democrats kept saying, "Oh, well, but the problem is, you see, crime is down in D.C., so why are they sending the troops in?" And to which, they'll say, "Well, okay, but crime is still high in the city. I mean, maybe it's less than it was during the peak of COVID, when it was just usually crime ridden. But this is an issue that is very visceral for a lot of people. They fear about their safety, right? So rather than saying, you know, well, actually, crime is not a problem. Say, actually, okay, crime is a problem, but what we have a different solution to it, right? I don't know. Say maybe we're going to double the number of police and give them real training and invest a lot more in our police and invest in community organizations that can mentor and help at risk young men who commit the most crimes, for example, or immigration, right? Democrats are well, what are we going to do about immigration? Well, immigration, obviously, we have a broken immigration system. You can't avoid this issue, right? But you could propose a different way of thinking about this issue. And what Democrats keep doing is, oh, we're going to focus on the issues where our pollsters tell us we do best, like healthcare. Okay, but we're going to have a shutdown fight over healthcare. Like, I mean, look, healthcare is important, uh, but the fight is over Medicaid cuts that affect a small number of people and don't go into effect until after the midterm elections. Like that is not an exciting new fight. That is just we're just rehashing the same arguments that we've been having since Obamacare passed in almost 20 years ago. Like, come on, give us something new, something exciting, something to bring people in, a new conflict that puts Republicans actually on the defensive.
What did you think of Ezra Klein's argument that the Democrats really can't vote to fund this government because of what Trump is doing, but yet he wasn't really sure about how they should stage the shutdown or how they should frame it, or even if they have the right
Well,
leaders?
that's fundamentally the problem, right? I mean, if Democrats were preparing a shutdown fight in April, or knowing that the government would run out of funding at the end of September, you could say, here's our one demand. You fund the government if if you know if what, right? Like you can't have a like yes, the Republicans are doing all kinds of awful things, but all kinds of awful things is just this vague, diffuse, all kinds of awful things. What is the one thing that we are gonna drive the conflict over? And they haven't figured out what that one thing is. And look, they have put out 100 things that the Trump administration is doing wrong. The House Oversight Dems say here are 100 things the Trump administration is doing wrong. Who has the time and the mental, and the energy to go through 100 things and figure them out? Just tell us the worst thing, and it's like that. There we have a limited processing capacity in our brain. Right, we only can focus on one thing at a time. We can't multitask. If I mean, maybe you can multitask if you're like watching this and like folding the laundry or something. But if you're trying to read a book and listen to this, so pick one thing, and pick the thing. I mean, the basic rule in politics is pick the issue, pick the conflict that brings in the most people and divides the opposition. Change the
So,
axis of conflict.
so the 2024 election seems to have been fought largely over issues like inflation and immigration. Does that suggest that those should be front and center in what the Democrats' demands should be?
Well, I mean, you could change the conversation about immigration if you wanted to, although you'd have to line up you have to do a lot of work ahead of time. I mean, inflation, was that like, I mean, sure, inflation might be a problem, or it might not be. Cost of living might be a problem, or it might not be. But it's not reorienting the major conflict. It's basically you can do cost of living issues if you just want to be the party out of power and say the cost of living is too high and elect us, and we won't be able to do anything about it because it's forces beyond our control. So it's just like, the economy is sort of the baseline, and to some extent, if the economy is good, the incumbent wins. If the economy is bad, the incumbent loses. But if you look at the data on presidential approval and economic and the state of the economy, the two have become delinked. Like it used to be the case prior to, I don't know, I actually have a Substack post on this called, I think I called it, Is It Still the Economy? Stupid. In which, I look at the data, quarterly approval ratings, quarterly consumer sentiment. And, prior to 2004, there's like a pretty decent correlation, better economy, higher approval rating. Then I break it down in the second graph, 2004 to present, correlation is flat. Like, so that's not what's driving things. Partisanship is driving things. So, I mean, sure, but it also, if Democrats are relying on inflation, what if the economy picks up in September 2026?
Hmm.
And that's all you've got is prices are too high, and suddenly they're not so high anymore.
Yeah, good point. I want to get your thoughts on some of the more fundamental changes you have argued for. So most of us have kind of grown up with the idea that we have 435 congressional districts, and we elect one person who gets a plurality of the votes to represent each district. But you make the point that it doesn't really have to be run that way, and we'd be in better shape and more similar to other major democracies if we had a much different system.
Yeah. So, the system that I advocate is proportional representation through multi-member districts. And so, right, I mean, we're used to, we have one congressional representative, and that's just how things are. But that's not how things are in most democracies. That's not how things have even always been in the U.S. I think a lot of people think things are just fixed at 435, but where did that number come from? Well, the original Congress was 65 members, and the idea was that every decade we'd take a census, and then the House would increase in response to the growing population. And we did that more or less up through 1911, and then for various reasons, Congress couldn't agree on how to reapportion the House after the 1920 census, and eventually in 1929 they fixed it at 435. So it's totally arbitrary. It's 100 years out of date. The population of the country has tripled. So maybe it's time to have a Congress that better reflects the population of the United States. Similarly with single member districts, right? I mean, what is sacrosanct about having one representative per district? It assumes that there's some, like, geography is the most important thing that we want to represent, and these individual districts have some unique quality that needs to only be represented by one person. Now, there might have been a time long ago, very long ago, when people didn't travel much, and there were some real distinctions around districts, but that time is gone, and the reality of the moment is that we have is geographic polarization, where Democrats live in certain places, Republicans live in other places. And you have these districts that are kind of drawn arbitrarily or redrawn. They don't really have any meaningful representation, and they lead to all kinds of problems of gerrymandering and non-competitiveness and binary zero-sum politics. So why not make larger districts, even many states, just one single statewide district? All the parties run their best candidates statewide, and then parties get a share of seats in direct proportion to the share of votes they get. I mean, people say, "Oh, it's not fair." Texas is gerrymandering. Democrats get, Republicans get 55% of the vote. Why should they get 85% of the seats? I mean, inherently, we're saying we want election results to be proportional. So why not actually put in place a system in which proportionality is the way that we do elections to make them fair, which is what most other democracies around the world do. It just seems very uh,
And
silly to me.
you think the results are superior in those democracies?
Um, I think on balance they are. Now there are obviously a lot of other factors, and you could certainly point to some countries that are worse, some countries that are better. But I think that if you compare across all countries, what you find in more proportional democracies is higher citizen satisfaction, higher voting rates, better representation, uh, and a more equal economy.
Those
and
sound like,
and more democratic help. Now,
yeah.
obviously, law of large numbers. There's going to be some variation. You'll say, oh, what about Italy, or what about Israel? What about? And I would say, well, what about Denmark, and what about Sweden, and what about Norway? So,
Yeah.
right,
So, really a bold idea. Do you think there's any sort of pathway to getting there?
sure, there's a pathway. Why not? Congress could pass a law tomorrow. It doesn't require a constitutional amendment. And look, I think we are in a moment in which more and more people are asking these fundamental questions of why do we do elections this way? And it's totally arbitrary. There's no good reason for it. It's just history. Now, should we still be, curing people with bloodletting and leeches because that's what they did in 1787? I mean, maybe that's where maybe that's where the FDA is going at this
Yeah.
point. But it's probably not a great idea.
Yeah. Wanted to touch on, the awful news yesterday about assassination, um, and just get your thoughts about how that, how do you structure politics going forward in a way that doesn't encourage more political violence?
Yeah, I mean, it is a real tragedy, and uh, this is something a lot of folks have been warning about for a while, saying we're in a politics in which there is so much dehumanization, so much antipathy. That is a precursor to political violence, and I mean, violence is always wrong. Murder is always wrong. Uh, you know, but at the same time, there are a lot of politicians who are stoking a very divisive rhetoric, and I mean, honestly, Charlie Kirk was one of those people who was stoking a very divisive rhetoric. That's certainly not alone, but it does that divisive rhetoric does flow from this binary two-party system in which every election becomes this high-stakes contest for control of the country. And one thing that you do notice when you look comparatively is that countries with more parties have more shifting coalitions, and there's just less antipathy because different parties sometimes work together. And this used to be the case in the US. We had liberal Republicans who often worked with Democrats. We had conservative Democrats, excuse me, who often worked with Republicans. And there were lots of politicians who said lots of nice things about bipartisanship. And so it taught citizens that, oh, the other party is different, but they are also patriotic Americans. And now we have a politics of binary division where Democrats and Republicans are constantly saying the other side is evil, that they are, and we are good. And if we are good and they are evil, well, what does good need to do to evil? It needs to dominate it and destroy it. And that leads to the kind of politics where people think, well, the only way to settle this is through violence. and that is, to use a technical political science term, effed up.
Right. So it's been a fascinating conversation. We've covered a lot in about 30 minutes. Anything else, Lee, you wanted to add?
Well, I mean, I feel like it's really a dark time now in our politics, and I think it's very easy to kind of feel like this is just it. We're just in a dark era, and that's just where we're going to be. But I do think it's really important to start thinking about what the next era of politics look like, because this is an age of pessimism, but there will be another age of optimism ahead. Because this is read some history. These things have a cyclical nature to them, and I think it's really important in this moment for those who care about this country, who love this country, and who are invested in our democracy and our future, to start thinking about, what do we want to see after this fire burns out, because there will be an opportunity to rebuild. And I think now is the time to start thinking about the future that we want. And it's also the one thing that keeps me from going into a black hole of depression, is constantly trying to think about what that future ought to look like for my kids, and maybe someday my grandkids.
Well, I think that's a good note on which to end. And it's been a pleasure. Thanks so much. And
Well,
hope to.
thank you for having me. And if folks are interested in getting more from me, my Substack Undercurrent Events is free. No, no, you don't have to pay for it. You can read it for free, all you want. Share it with all your friends.
Great. I recommend it highly.
Thank
Thanks,
you.
Lee.
I appreciate that.
Bye
All
bye.
right. Take care. All right.